The movie opens in Los Angeles, where, under the cover of night, a man named Louis Bloom is seen cutting through a fence near a railway track. He then takes the stolen metal to a scrapyard and, after some intense bargaining, manages to sell it for cash. Later, while heading back, Louis notices several police cars gathered nearby. Curious, he approaches the scene and finds a car engulfed in flames after a serious accident, with people trapped inside. Amid the chaos, he sees a man named Joe Loader filming the incident with his partner. Louis becomes immediately fascinated by what they are doing. After the situation calms down, Louis approaches Joe and asks about his work. Joe explains that his job is to reach crime and accident scenes as quickly as possible, record footage, and then sell it to news channels for the highest price. Intrigued by the idea, Louis expresses his desire to join him, but Joe refuses. The next day, when Louis sees news coverage of the same accident on TV, his interest in this line of work grows even stronger. Soon after, Louis goes to a beach, where he steals a bicycle from a young boy and quickly escapes. He then trades the bicycle at a pawn shop in exchange for a camcorder and a police scanner. That same night, he begins listening to police radio communications, trying to track incidents in real time. However, he struggles to understand the coded language used by the police and has difficulty figuring out the fastest routes to reach the locations. Eventually, Louis arrives at a scene where the police are arresting a man, but he is quickly told to leave. Not long after, he reaches another location where a car has been attacked, and he attempts to film an injured victim up close. However, the police force him, and another cameraman, to leave the scene. The other cameraman becomes frustrated with Louis, blaming him for ruining his chance to capture the footage. Determined to learn, Louis secretly follows the cameraman and listens carefully to his conversation, trying to understand how he negotiates with news channels and sets prices for his footage. Using this information, Louis heads to a local news station and meets Nina Romina, the director of a morning news program. She finds Louis' footage compelling and calls in producer Frank Cruz for his opinion. Frank initially objects, saying that such graphic content isn't suitable for morning television. However, Nina insists that they can air it with a warning, emphasizing that shocking and violent stories attract viewers. Since Nina is in charge, she ultimately decides to purchase Louis' footage. Although the payment is lower than Louis had hoped, Nina encourages him to invest in a better camera to improve the quality of his work, as she is interested in buying more footage from him in the future. Louis then asks her what kind of crimes attract the most attention, and Nina explains that audiences are drawn to intense, violent incidents filled with danger and bloodshed. The following morning, Louis watches his footage being broadcast on television, and for the first time, he feels a sense of achievement. Motivated by this success, he begins studying police codes more seriously, memorizing their meanings to improve his response time. Soon after, he decides to expand his efforts and starts interviewing a young man named Rick, considering him for a potential role in his growing operation. After this, Louis deliberately asks a series of questions to test a young man named Rick, and eventually hires him. Rick doesn't own a camera, but he knows how to use GPS efficiently, which makes him valuable. Louis offers to pay him $30 per night, and together they begin working as a team. That same evening, as they sit in the car listening to the police scanner, Louis starts teaching Rick the meaning of various police codes so they can respond faster to incidents. After some time, they hear reports of a fire and immediately rush toward the location. Rick's job is to guide Louis through the quickest route, but Louis becomes overly aggressive and starts shouting in his desperation to arrive first. Under pressure, Rick makes a mistake and directs him the wrong way. By the time they reach the scene, the injured victims have already been taken away. Furious, Louis scolds Rick, but Rick points out that Louis' reckless behavior caused the confusion. Learning from this, Louis controls himself the next time, and they manage to arrive at a crime scene right on time. At one such incident, a house has been burglarized and possibly turned into a violent crime scene, but the police have already sealed the area. Ignoring the law, Louis secretly sneaks inside the house. Once inside, he manipulates the environment, positioning family photographs near bullet holes, to create a more emotional and dramatic visual. He even records footage of the victims in a way that would evoke sympathy from viewers, and before leaving, he gathers personal details about them to add more context to the story. When Louis presents this footage to Nina Romina, she is highly impressed. Although Frank Cruz points out that Louis illegally entered the house, Nina doesn't seem to care, as the footage is exactly the kind of content that boosts ratings. From that point on, Louis and Rick continue to cover increasingly disturbing and sensational stories. Rick helps navigate quickly through the city, while Louis shamelessly records the suffering of victims, focusing on capturing the most dramatic visuals possible. Louis becomes obsessed with his work, even recording broadcasts of his own footage from TV and saving them as personal achievements. As he earns more money, he invests in better equipment, buying new cameras for both himself and Rick so they can capture footage from multiple angles. One night, they even arrive at a car crash scene before the police. Seeing that one of the drivers is already dead, Louis drags the body into better lighting to improve the shot and begins filming without hesitation. Shortly after, the police arrive and force him to leave, but by then, he has already captured everything he needs, beating competitors like Joe Loader to the footage. Later, when Louis sells this footage to Nina, she notices blood on his shirt, hinting at how far he has crossed ethical boundaries. Despite this, Louis boldly asks Nina out to dinner. She initially refuses, saying she doesn't mix work with personal relationships. However, Louis coldly threatens to stop selling her his footage if she declines. Left with no real choice, Nina reluctantly agrees. On Saturday night, Louis takes Nina to dinner and makes his intentions clear: he wants her to be his girlfriend. Nina once again tries to keep things professional, but Louis becomes irritated and reminds her that her channel was struggling before his footage started boosting its viewership. By now, Louis has grown highly confident and manipulative, fully aware of the power he holds in this disturbing line of work. As Louis' influence grows, it becomes clear that if he starts selling his footage to rival stations, Nina Romina could even lose her job. Because of this pressure, she reluctantly gives in to his demands and becomes personally involved with him, blurring the line between business and manipulation. Not long after, Rick once again fails to get Louis to a location on time, causing them to miss the biggest crime story of the night. A competing team arrives first and captures the footage, even mocking Louis for falling behind. Later, when Louis delivers other clips to Nina, she becomes furious because another channel aired the most important story of the night. The next morning, when Louis watches footage shot by Joe Loader on television, he is overwhelmed with anger and smashes a bathroom mirror in frustration. Consumed by jealousy and revenge, Louis begins plotting against Joe. He considers sabotaging him and later visits his house with the intention of damaging his van. That same night, Louis and Rick arrive at a car crash scene, only to discover that the wrecked vehicle belongs to Joe. Joe is severely injured. Rick suggests that since Joe is essentially doing the same job as them, they should show some respect and not film him. But Louis ignores this and coldly starts recording Joe in his vulnerable state. Joe looks at him with anger, but is too injured to respond. A few days later, Louis and Rick arrive at a mansion where a violent break-in has just occurred. As Louis enters the house, he notices the criminals fleeing the scene and secretly records them getting into their van. Instead of reporting this crucial information, he continues inside and begins filming the aftermath: blood on the floor and the injured victims lying around. When he reaches the final victim, he realizes the man is still alive, but instead of helping him, Louis keeps recording and then leaves before the police arrive. Later, Louis deliberately edits out the footage of the criminals and the surviving victim, choosing only the most sensational parts. He then presents the edited footage to Nina, who is highly impressed. She even consults her legal advisor about whether it can be aired. The lawyer confirms that as long as the victims' identities are concealed, there won't be any legal issues. Taking advantage of the situation, Louis demands $15,000 for the footage. Nina initially hesitates, saying she cannot afford such a high price, but Louis pressures her by threatening to sell it elsewhere. He also insists that his production company be credited on air. With no real alternative, Nina agrees. When the story is finally broadcast, Louis feels a surge of pride as he hears his company's name mentioned on television. Behind the scenes, Nina pushes the anchors to present the story in a more dramatic and sensational way to captivate viewers. The broadcast is so successful that her boss calls to praise her and even asks to meet Louis. However, the situation takes a turn the next morning when Detective Frontieri and her partner arrive to question Louis about the mansion incident. Staying calm and calculated, Louis fabricates a story, claiming that he simply heard gunshots and arrived at the scene afterward, carefully hiding the truth about what he actually witnessed and recorded. When questioned, Louis calmly tells the detectives that he entered the house only to help, but by the time he got inside, it was already too late. He claims he started recording the scene just to preserve evidence. He also mentions seeing a van leaving the area but insists he couldn't identify the criminals. After Detective Frontieri and her partner leave, Louis secretly investigates further and manages to track down the van's license plate, which eventually leads him to the suspect's address. Soon, Louis and Rick position themselves outside the criminal's house and begin waiting. Rick urges him to immediately inform the police, but by now, Louis has started seeing himself as the director of his own crime story. Instead of reporting right away, he wants the suspects to go out into the city and create a more dramatic situation where the police chase them. His disturbing mindset shocks Rick, who realizes how dangerous this plan is. Feeling the risk, Rick demands a higher payment of $75 per night. Without hesitation, Louis agrees, which makes Rick realize he could have asked for even more. After some time, one of the criminals leaves the house and picks up his partner. Louis and Rick follow them until they arrive at a restaurant. Only then does Louis call the police, providing details about the suspects and informing them that they are armed and responsible for the earlier murders at the mansion. He even gives his name, making sure to take credit for discovering them. Rick assumes that Louis is trying to claim the reward money and demands half of it. Although annoyed, Louis agrees, mainly because he needs Rick to capture footage from a different angle. He then hands Rick a camera and sends him to the other side of the restaurant while he positions himself elsewhere. Soon, the police arrive, and as they approach the suspects, the situation escalates instantly. The criminals open fire, leading to a chaotic shootout that results in the deaths of several innocent bystanders. Throughout the chaos, Louis and Rick continue recording everything. One of the criminals is killed during the exchange, while the other is injured but manages to escape in a van, triggering a high-speed chase. Police vehicles pursue the suspect, and Louis, along with Rick, follows closely behind, filming every moment. Louis aggressively urges Rick to keep recording as the chase intensifies. The speeding vehicles create havoc on the road, and at one point, a civilian car collides with a police vehicle. Despite this, another police car continues chasing the suspect. Suddenly, the fleeing criminal crashes his van into a police car, bringing the chase to a violent halt. Louis quickly jumps out and starts filming the aftermath, assuming the suspect is dead. He then calls Rick over, instructing him to record the scene so he can learn how to capture such raw and shocking visuals. However, as Rick approaches, it becomes clear that the criminal is still alive. In a sudden moment, the man opens fire and shoots Rick. Even in this horrifying situation, Louis shows no concern and continues filming instead of helping. The injured criminal attempts to target Louis as well, but upon hearing approaching police sirens, he tries to escape. Moments later, the police arrive and fatally shoot him. Afterward, Louis walks over to Rick, who is badly wounded, and instead of helping him, he begins recording his injuries. In that moment, Rick realizes the horrifying truth, that Louis knew the criminal was still alive and deliberately sent him forward to create a more dramatic and violent scene for his footage. There isn't even a hint of emotion on Louis' face as Rick lies dying in front of him. Rick takes his final breath, and instead of reacting like a normal human being, Louis simply takes the camera and walks away, treating the entire Gatna as just another opportunity. He then heads straight to Nina Romina and hands over the footage. Watching such intense and disturbing visuals, Nina is thrilled, knowing it will bring massive attention to her channel. Soon after, Detective Frontieri arrives at the station and demands the footage. However, Nina refuses to hand it over without a warrant. The investigation continues, and Louis is called in for questioning once again. At the station, he calmly repeats the same fabricated story, sticking to his lies without any hesitation. The detective, frustrated and disgusted, accuses him of building his entire livelihood on the suffering and bloodshed of others, telling him he should be ashamed of himself. But without solid evidence to prove his involvement, she has no choice but to let him go. Weeks later, Louis has fully transformed his operation into a business. He purchases his own van, expands his setup, and hires 3 new assistants. Now, instead of working alone, he leads a small team, sending them out into the night in search of breaking news. As he drives off with his crew, it becomes clear that Louis has not only embraced this dark world, but mastered it, turning crime and tragedy into a profitable empire without any guilt or remorse.